thinking about how hard change is. I had a beautiful conversation a couple of weeks ago with two of the religious school mothers who were going through really positive changes and talking about how, even when a change is overwhelmingly good, one was starting a new job she's really excited about, one was talking about kids growing up, graduations, things like that, that there's still always a sadness, even if the thing coming up is good, at what's being left behind. And of course, many changes are much more complex than that. So I am feeling a sadness right now, as I've shared in my emails. And also for me, with this particular change, there's the hard part that I'm stepping into an unknown. People keep asking me, what am I doing next? And, finding a job is a full-time job. And so I'm very blessed to be able to take some time to figure that out. But it means that I'm leaving something, trusting that I will find something else. And that's scary. And it takes an act of faith. Some of you may remember at Kol Nidre 2 years ago, I spoke about bitachon, which is trust or faith. And I told the story of a panic attack I had had on a mountainside. And that, I was on a very steep slope, and I literally started hyperventilating. And the remarkable thing was that the next day, I was able to do just as steep a slope, but the drop was only a foot. And so I walked across it totally confident and no problem. Right, so bitachon is what it feels like to walk through life with an inner faith that whatever comes your way, you will be able to handle it. That the divinity within you will stand with you. I actually went back and reread my sermon this week. It was helpful. And then it happened that in the study group that I facilitate on Tuesday mornings, the Chakins, Marcia and Jan Chakin, brought us a midrash to study that spoke exactly to that experience of stepping into the unknown. And the midrash was interpreting 2 verses. So the first of the verses is from Deuteronomy, and it's the first source on your page. Acharei Adonai Elohechem telechu, you shall walk after Adonai your God. Voto tirau, you shall revere or fear him. Vet mitzvotav tishmoru, you shall guard or keep his mitzvot. Uvekolo tishmau, you shall listen to his voice. Voto ta'avodu, him you shall serve. Ubo tidbakun, and to him, meaning to God, you should cling. So if you can, without reading ahead, just that first phrase, Acharei Adonai Elohechem telechu, after Adonai your God, you shall walk. What comes to mind? Kind of what sorts of behaviors might you think this verse is talking about? What does it mean to walk in after God, to walk in God's path? I want to call out some suggestions. What kind of, just an example, Ellen. Yes, it fits right into Kedoshim. And this was, by the way, a midrash on this week's Torah portion, but the midrash often brings in sources from other places. So it also brought in this verse. Right, so to be holy. And, what's something from the holiness code that to you would epitomize walking in God's ways? Yeah. Great, don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. I'll throw out another one, Holden. Kindness, yeah. I mean, what comes to my mind is going out and feeding the poor. Right? I would think all the laws about the corners of the field, and to me, that would exemplify walking in God's ways. And what's fascinating is that the Midrash takes it in a completely different direction. That's not where the Midrash goes. So as I said, the Midrash was inherently about our Torah portion, and the second verse it's commenting on, Oh, I didn't reproduce the Hebrew for you. I am sorry. I meant to include the Hebrew of all the verses. I'll just read it. You need the Hebrew. Okay, I'll read it slowly. V'chi tavo el haaretz. When you come to the land, unitatem kol eitz ma'achal. And so this is the second verse on the page, and you plant every edible tree, kind of every fruit tree. Va'araltem orlato et pirio. Now, this word is not easily translated. There's really no English word, but you will orla the orla of its fruit. And in a minute, I'll explain what orla is. Shalosh shanim yelachem arelim lo yeachelu. For 3 years, the tree will be orla. You will not eat it. It will not be eaten. So what is orla? Orla comes in all kinds of contexts. It's the foreskin that's removed during circumcision. It's there's reference to orla of the heart, that the kind of a metaphorical thickening of the heart that has to be removed in order to open us to God's ways, to feeling and seeing God's presence. There's orla of the lips and difficulty in speaking. Orla is like piece that doesn't belong, that's clogging things up, that gets in the way of holiness, and it has to be removed. So the tree is orla for 3 years. The fruits produced by the tree can't be eaten for 3 years, and because that somehow those first fruits are getting in the way of the holiness of the tree. And the rabbis in this midrash are curious about the language, and when you come to the land. So if you look at the verse, like, those words seem unnecessary. When you enter the land, just start with when you plant any tree for food, treat it as orla, right? Why do we need to be, why is it mentioning coming to the land? And anytime that there is extra words in a verse, that's an invitation for the rabbis to get really creative. And that's the question that our midrash is going to deal with. So it's the third source on your page. Rabbi Yehuda ben Shimon began, "You shall walk after Adonai your God." So that's our Deuteronomy verse. "Is it possible for flesh and blood to follow the blessed Holy One? The one of whom it is written, your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters," right? So Rabbi Yehuda is asking, like, how is it possible to walk after God? God is, beyond human capacity. "And you shall cling to him." Now he's quoting the end of that verse in Deuteronomy. "Is it possible for flesh and blood to ascend heavenward and cling to the divine presence? The one of whom it is written, for Adonai your God is a consuming fire, and it is written his throne was sparks of fire." How can you cling to God? God is made of fire, right? So God exists in this place of chaos and powers beyond us. How could we possibly walk after this or cling to it? And then Rabbi Yehuda offers an answer. "Rather, from the beginning of the creation of the world, the Blessed Holy One engaged first only in planting. That is what is written, Adonai God planted a garden in Eden. You too, when you enter the land, engage first only in planting. That is what is written when you will come into the land and plant." So he's giving an explanation for these extra words, and the explanation is to be godly, to walk after God's ways, means that when you encounter something new, when you encounter uncertainty, when you're feeling afraid, when you're not sure what comes next, you plant. I just think it's beautiful. In our study group, as we encountered this midrash, we were struck, and I imagine some of you are as well, by how perfectly the early Zionists, I don't think they were studying this text, they just knew. They came to the land, and there was malaria and poverty and that kind of fearful uncertainty, life and death. That so many people died in those early years. And what did they do? They made the deserts bloom. Out of chaos, they created these orderly forests. Leslie Weinstein, who's in our group, the study group, reminded us all of the, a tree was planted in your honor in Israel, certificates, right? This is the epitome of how, when Jews returned to our land, the first thing we did was plant. I brought here as the fourth source, Theodore Herzl. If you will it, it is no fantasy, right? If this overwhelming challenge can be faced. So to walk in God's path means you have to have enough faith to put tiny seeds or little saplings into the soil, knowing that the seeds might not grow, knowing that you won't get anything back for at least 3 years. That's what the verse is telling us. Still, you take the first step, you plant the seeds. And this is true whether it's starting a new nation, whether it's casting out into something new in your own personal life. And it's even more true when you're facing an unknown that seems overwhelmed with fear and darkness. And here I've been thinking about, I think we were studying this shortly after the footage. We all saw the footage of the forests of Hare Yehuda, the hills around Jerusalem, going up in flames. It felt like a reversal of the process of what the Chalutzim, the early pioneers, had done. They planted the trees, and now the trees were going up in smoke. Or, seeing the devastation in Los Angeles, just seeing the pictures of what's left after the fire. And God, sitting on a throne of flames, plants trees. So I wanted to lift up that at the end of May, we'll be having 2 opportunities to be inspired by Israeli environmentalists who are continuing to walk in God's path, even as they're surrounded by smoke and flames. The first is on Tuesday evening, not this Tuesday evening, May 27th. Dr. Alon Tal, who's a visiting professor at Stanford and a former member of Knesset, will be speaking to our community about environmentalism in Israel, and he'll be focusing particularly on the impact of the war and offering a vision for the future amidst all this loss and uncertainty. And then 2 days later, Dr. Tal is organizing a conference at Stanford that's a collaboration between the Israel Fellows Program and the Door School of Sustainability. I just think it's an amazing collaboration, and he's invited our community to attend. Now, about the same time that these 2 opportunities are going on, we are also going to have the opportunity to be inspired by people who are planting seeds in the face of another calamity that can feel almost as desperately hopeless as climate change. And that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Before I say more about that, I want to take us back into our Torah portion. This week's portion includes the most famous mitzvah of the Torah, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's one heck of an abstract ideal. But within the context of the verse, the mitzvah, love your neighbor, is tied to some very concrete mitzvot. And again, just like our midrash about walking in God's path, they're not the mitzvot that you might expect. So I think many of you probably do know the context, but you may not. If you didn't know the context and you were writing the Torah, what mitzvot would you choose to associate with the ideal of loving your neighbor? Any suggestions? Hold on. Charity, yeah. I mean, the same as walking in God's path, really, right? That's the first one I went to. And other thoughts, like what goes with loving your neighbor? I mean, clothing the hungry, feeding the sick. Clothing the hungry, caring for the sick. All these acts of loving kindness. But in fact, in the text itself, this mitzvah of loving your neighbor is mostly associated with negative commandments. What not what not to do, as if, or perhaps because, the greatest act of love, the hardest act of love, is actually holding back from hurting each other. In some ways, it's almost easier to be generous than it is to hold back from causing hurt. And so now we'll go back to the source sheet. And I did reproduce the verses in Hebrew as well as English. So, lo telech rachel b'amecha. Do not go around bearing slander amongst your people. Lo ta'amod adam re'echa ani Adonai. And don't stand on the blood of your fellow. I am God. Don't stand on your blood. Your fellow can mean different things, but it's usually understood to mean don't stand idly by if you see violence, step in. What I want to point out, there's so much you could say about this verse. What I want to lift up right now is just the connection between slander and violence. That these two being in the same verse is highlighting for us that a culture of hateful words can often lead to a culture of physical violence. Next verse. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You will surely rebuke your neighbor. Velo tisa alav chet. And don't carry a sin because of them. So again, tons we could say about this verse. Bearing our anger in our hearts is dangerous. When we have a culture of not talking to each other, things can spiral out of control very quickly. And before we read the third verse in this trio, I want to take you to the next source on my page. It's on the flip side, on the back side. So this came, my daughter is, my older daughter is currently a sophomore at Johns Hopkins, and the parents all got an email that there was another encampment, kind of a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel encampment, but it was actually quickly dispersed this time. And they shared with us the letter that the president had written to the protesters. It was a beautiful letter. And it reminded me of the letter he'd written a year ago when it took a little longer to disperse the encampment. Not as bad as on some campuses. His letter was quite beautiful, and he started by talking about the danger of violence. He said, I know that you don't intend violence, but we have seen violence on many campuses, and when you set up these encampments, you're creating a space that, for various reasons, will lead to violence, sometimes against you, the protesters, sometimes by protesters against others, sometimes in both directions. So that was the first thing he lifted up, and I'm thinking again of that first verse in our trio. And then I'm going to read his next paragraph because I think it's really powerful. We recognize that the encampment is useful in seizing our attention. It forces us, so I'm source 6 on the back side of the page. It forces us to confront different frames or narratives on the conflict. But that is as far as it goes. By physically demarcating a space and by gathering, studying, and chanting with only those people who subscribe to a similar worldview on an incredibly complex subject, you fail to honor the university's foundational imperative for conversation across difference, for conversation that aims to test, evaluate, and understand competing claims. An encampment of this nature cannot help but reduce the capacity of those within it to see the common humanity of those who are outside its perimeter. Instead of recognizing and drawing strength from our diversity, we veer to a community of rigid solitudes, a community defined by suspicion, distrust, and in the extreme, hatred. Along the way, our common humanity is lost. So this brings us to the third most powerful verse of the trio. Lo tikom, so it's source 5 on your sheet, the third verse. Lo tikom velo titor et b'nei amecha. Do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge against your fellow, your people, members of your people. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your fellow as yourself. I am Adonai. It is hard not to crave revenge against the other that you do not understand. The other that you have not been talking to and, more importantly, listening to, but instead have been talking about and directing anger towards. Look at the next source on your sheet, source 7. This is from a 19th century biblical commentator, Davar. Love your neighbor as yourself. The warning against revenge is connected to this, right? They're in the same verse. If you were to do something bad to another person, you would desire that they not take revenge on you, but rather that they would let it go. So you should behave that way towards your fellow. In other words, in the moment that we desire revenge, we've lost our ability to see ourselves in the other person's place, to see them as human like ourselves. And we've also lost the ability to recognize that we ourselves have sometimes hurt others and would not want revenge taken on us. So while I was on my little mini sabbatical in Jerusalem, I wasn't looking at these particular sources, but I was thinking about these ideas and about how I have chosen a life where I am surrounded by people who love Israel and whose story is part of the Israeli story, and how little I really understand about the Palestinian story. So I read 2 books by Palestinian writers while I was there. The first one was very, very hard for me. It's by a man named Raja Shahade. He's a beautiful writer. His words are filled with love of the land and of his people. But he is so angry at Israel. There was absolutely no space in his words for our story. And he does this thing that we all become very familiar with from reading the news, but I think most of us not from direct conversation, because we're not most of us in direct conversation. I know I hadn't been until fairly recently. He does this thing of trying to separate Israel from Judaism, right? He wants to say, I'm not against Jews, I'm against Israel. And that infuriates me. Like, how can he define my Judaism for me? You're going to tell me that my Judaism is separable from my Zionism? Because it is not. So, Shahade's book had literary merit, but I did not like it at all. And then I read a book called In This Place Together, which was actually written by an American Jewish woman in close collaboration with the Palestinian man that she was writing about. So he is sort of a co-author and fully approved it. His name's Suleiman Khatib, but he goes by the nickname Suli. His book is beautifully written. It was also hard to read. Suli and his family suffered terribly from the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and they're still suffering. And, it's really easy to dismiss those college kids who have no investment and, for the most part, no knowledge of the region, and they're shouting accusations of genocide as if they even understand what that term means. But it's a whole different thing to read a Palestinian telling his own story of suffering and to just shake it off. So this was a hard book to read. But unlike Shahade, Suli makes space in his book for our story too. And I have to say, in the second half of the book, the first, because it follows his progression and his growth. He started out as a terrorist at the age of 14, and he transformed himself. So he makes space to see Jewish and Israeli suffering, as well as Palestinian suffering. He acknowledges Jewish connection to the land. That's essential. He seeks out Israeli partners, and he wants his people, and this is also really important to me, he wants his people to own their part in creating the conflict. But there's a catch, because he wants our people to own our part as well. And that's not easy. So on Tuesday, May 20th, the Consul General of Germany will be visiting CBJ. I'll be talking about what Germany is doing to support Israel. His talk represents for me the tremendous potential of hocheach tochiach, that last verse, of genuine rebuke and remorse, that even after actual genocide, the genocide that defined genocide, 2 generations later, there has been real teshuvah in Germany. And there's been forgiveness and healing in the Jewish community, which is really amazing, really amazing. Now let's look at the last source on the page. It's from the Jerusalem Talmud, Halacha. It is written, you should not take revenge or nurse hatred, bear a grudge against your fellow countrymen. How is that? Imagine you're cutting meat and the knife falls down from one hand to the other hand and injures it. Should he go and hit the hand that was holding the knife? In other words, you're going to punish the hand that was holding the knife because it caused pain to the other hand? No, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva said that is a great principle in the Torah. Ben Azai says, Ele Toldot Adam, this is the book of the descent of man, is an even more important principle because it includes the principle that all of humanity is one family. Sometimes it can seem that there's no way to recover from the brutality of what Hamas did to us on October 7th. How can we ever forgive? And if we cannot forgive them, and they cannot forgive us for the violence that followed, then the future is truly hopeless. And it may be way too early, but I will say that I believe that Israel is the land of miracles. I believe that if you will it, it is no dream. I believe that Israel is the land of God, and that in the face of uncertainty, God starts by planting. So I invite you all to read Suli's book. Reading that book may be like planting a seed within yourself. I've ordered 10 copies. They haven't arrived yet, but when they will, they can be shared around. Although you might want to pick up your own copy so you can mark it up. And on June 21st, which will be my final Shabbat in the role of rabbi here, I invite you to engage with me in a conversation about Suli's book. Let's plant seeds together. Shabbat Shalom.